Okay, so today we're going to look at the lead up to the Civil War. In our previous units, we talked about the slave trade and we talked about the expansion of the U.S., and that's where we're going to start. So, starting with the Louisiana Purchase, which we can see here, and then eventually this land over here, which will go from Spain to Mexico, and then we will fight a war with Mexico, and it will become part of the U.S. We had all this new territory, and there was this question about where does slavery spread or not spread? If you remember, under the Articles of Confederation, it had laid out a plan for how territory turns into states. And so there is this question over, as this new territory becomes states, does it become a slave state or a free state? And there was all sorts of debate and conflict. And what we're going to see is that starting with the Constitution all the way up until the Civil War, they just keep finding ways to kick the problem of slavery further down the road and then deal with it later. And eventually we reach a point where it can't be dealt with any later. Okay? And so the first sort of big way that they try to deal with this question is with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So Missouri is right here, and it was ready. It was, started out as part of the Louisiana Territory, but now it was ready to become its own state. And a lot of slave owners and stuff had moved here, and so it was going to be admitted, it wanted to be admitted as a slave state. But then there was this question over, can we admit it? People in the North didn't necessarily want it to be admitted as a slave state, and so they came up with this Missouri Compromise. And basically, what it did is it allowed Missouri to become a state that was a slave-owning state, but then it turned this land that had been part of Massachusetts into its own state, and it was a free state. And so what that meant was that while you're adding one more slave state to the United States, you're also adding one more free state. So that was like the compromise. Okay? And then you can see that there's this line under Missouri here. Okay? And this becomes the Missouri Compromise line. And the idea was that everything below this line would be allowed to be a slave state, and everything above it, except for Missouri, that was the exception as part of the compromise, would be admitted as a free state. And so below would be slave and above would be free. Kind of an interesting compromise that then kind of doesn't really work. Okay? So there's the line, there's Maine and Missouri. And this is just another example of that line spread out once you spread the U.S. out across its entire length once it gets that new land. And again, the idea was below the line would be a slave state, above the line would be a free state. But we're going to see that there's more problems to come of this. For example, California here. What's going to happen when it becomes a state? Because part of it is above the line, part of it is below the line. So that lasts for about 30 years until you get the Compromise of 1850. Compromise of 1850 had to do with that California, right? California didn't really have a lot of slave owners and plantations because it was so far removed from that land and culture of growing cotton down here. And it wanted to be admitted as a free state. But the leaders of the southern states didn't want that to happen, and so they wanted to get something in return for admitting a free state without admitting a slave state. And so what they did is they passed this new fugitive slave law. So they let California enter the Union of the United States as a free state, but there was this new fugitive slave law. And basically, there had already been a fugitive slave law which said if a slave tries to escape into a state that allows freedom and does not allow slavery, that they could be arrested and sent back down to a slave state, which is represented here in both the red and in the yellow. And but lots of northern states had found ways around this and had kind of just not arrested people and stuff like that. In fact, right here in Cass County, Michigan, a lot of escaped slaves had settled down and were openly living and had not been arrested by authorities and sent back down. And so this new fugitive slave law was tougher. If you didn't arrest uh, a escaped slave that you encountered, you yourself could be fined. There was no trial by jury to determine had that person been a slave, had they run away, or were they in fact just a free black living in the North. No trial by jury. They could just be immediately shipped down. And this was pretty harsh and strong. And so we see the Underground Railroad kind of arise to counter it, right? Where now that it was a lot harder for an escaped slave to get north, there was a big movement to smuggle them safely into those northern states, and sometimes all the way to Canada. This kind of worked, but not. They changed some rules, so the New Mexico and Utah territories were now allowed to do what we call popular sovereignty on the issue of slavery. So if you remember in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the idea was below the line, slave, above the line, free for new states entering the United States. But what the Compromise of 1850 says is that they get to vote on how they want to do it. So that's what we call popular sovereignty. Popular meaning the people, sovereignty meaning they have control over their territory. So the people in that territory could vote. Do we want to be a slave state or do we want to be a free state? So it got rid of that whole line thing. Part of the Compromise of 1850 also involved Texas. So Texas dropped its claims to eastern New Mexico for $10 million, which meant that over here, instead of being part of Texas, was part of a territory that then had popular sovereignty to determine if it wanted to be a free state, or a slave state. And then lastly, in D.C., Washington, D.C., the sale of slavery was banned, but not the practice of slavery. So someone could own a slave in Washington, D.C., but they couldn't buy that slave in D.C. They'd have to go somewhere else and buy that slave. So all of these things were kind of a new compromise, got rid of the line, and said let the new territories vote if they wanted to be a free state or a slave state. But again, all this really did was just kick the issue further down the road, because now you just have a bunch of states that might end up free and a bunch of states that might end up slave states. And that's going to continue here at the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is going to do the same thing with Kansas and Nebraska, where basically they are going to have popular sovereignty to determine if they want to be slave states or free states. Now, compared to the New Mexico and Utah territories over here, the Nebraska and Kansas territories are a lot closer to the rest of the U.S. So what we see happening with the Kansas-Nebraska Act is that a lot of settlers start moving into Kansas that are either pro-slavery or pro-free state, and then they start fighting each other, actual fighting. And so we get this term bleeding Kansas, as people actually fought. And there was movements among abolitionists like, hey, you need to move to Kansas so that you can vote for it to be a free state, etc. Okay? And one of those examples of someone who was an abolitionist who moved to Kansas to fight for it to be a free state, both in his words but also literally fighting, was a man named John Brown. And he's going to come up later. Him and his sons, he gathered around to really fight for the cause of abolition. Now, while all this territory question is going on over what happens to the territories, do they become slaves or free, we get the Dred Scott case, which was a Supreme Court case ultimately. It started in the lower courts and worked its way up to the Supreme Court, about this man, Dred Scott. So, Dred Scott has quite the interesting history of being a slave and being sold between multiple owners. And the gist of the story is that he spent some time in free states. He started out in Alabama and then in Missouri, which were slave states. But his owners moved to places like Wisconsin and Illinois, which were free. And then when he was in Missouri, he um, tried to say that he was free because he had lived in a free state. And in fact, Missouri had a law on the books that said if a slave lives in a free state, then they become free. And so he originally won, but then, his owner appealed and then he lost. So then he appealed and then he lost and then he appealed it to the Supreme Court and ultimately went to the U.S. Supreme Court, in this case, Dred Scott versus Sandford. And what the Supreme Court ruled was that he had to stay a slave and was not free. But they ruled even more than that. And what's interesting is that the Supreme Court chief, the head of the Supreme Court justice, was actually one of these people who was personally against slavery. He had actually had slaves and sold them all. But he came down in the rest of the Supreme Court really harsh on the side of states' rights and made this even racial argument here. That he said in the Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that slaves and those whose ancestors were slaves do not have the rights of citizens of the United States. So even a freed black living in America was not a citizen, or even someone who is the child and had been free their entire life, whose parents had been a slave at some point, were not viewed, according to the United States Supreme Court in 1857, as citizens of the United States. And that's going to be, we already talked about the amendments, but when we talk about, right, the amendment that guarantees citizenship to those that used to be slaves, that's going to be to overturn this Supreme Court case. Okay, and ultimately also ruled that some parts of the Missouri Compromise were unconstitutional. This idea that you could be freed from being slavery just by moving somewhere else, the Supreme Court felt like went against the right to property that was protected in the Constitution. And so he ultimately loses, which led to all sorts of complaints among the anti-slavery folks. So we can see here, this is just a talk that someone's going to give to talk about the atrocious decision of the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case. And then here is another one that calls that Supreme Court case. Oh no, I'm ahead of myself. Sorry, I thought I had another slide. Never mind. So anyhow, you can see that it caused outrage. So ultimately, he was viewed to be a slave. What an interesting thing personally in his case is that his owner, who owned him, actually married an abolitionist, and the abolitionist, this is weird, chose not to free him, but rather to sell him to someone else because he felt like, I can't own a slave. So he sold him to someone else. And he actually sold him back to the son of his first owner. And because he'd had several owners, he sold him to the son of his first owner, which had actually started to fight for him and help Dred Scott, who couldn't read, in his Supreme Court process. And the son of his first owner actually freed him as a slave a few months after the Supreme Court ruled that he was to remain a slave. So he actually ended up being freed, but he only lived for about another year after he was freed. Okay, so I got ahead of myself here, but now we're back. So John Brown, who we had talked about, moving to Kansas to try to fight for it to become a free state, decides to go one step further. And in 1859, in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is now in West Virginia, but at the time West Virginia was part of Virginia, it splits during the Civil War, he decides to go to a federal armory where there was a bunch of weapons and ammunition and break in and steal the weapons. And his idea was he would then give these weapons to slaves, and they would start a rebellion for their own freedom. And so he was very against slavery, and so this was his plan. I'm going to break into a federal armory, steal the weapons, give them to the slaves, and we're going to start a revolution. And it doesn't go very well. He breaks into the federal armory. The feds figure this out. They fight back. A bunch of his sons die and people with him, and he never really gets the weapons out or to people. Ultimately, he survives the encounter, but he is put to death for treason, for breaking into a U.S. military base and stealing weapons. Right, he's a felony. He's a treasonist, and he had killed people to do so. And so John Brown kind of splits the opinions. Right, is he on one hand a martyr who dies for his cause, who said slavery is so evil that we need to take matters into our own hands, or instead of a martyr, is he a murderer, right? A man who literally attacks a U.S. military base to steal weapons, right, and commit treason against his country. And so here is just an example of this, someone who is on the side of the martyr, right? That he is a martyr, okay? That he fought for what was most important and didn't do anything wrong. Okay, so here is just some pictures of John Brown through the ages in his rapidly growing facial hair. So this was him at the time of Harper's Ferry, and this is kind of him in the time of Kansas when he's moving to Kansas and stuff. Okay, here is Harper's Ferry, where the U.S. military base was, and you can now go and see things, and so you can see where it was that he attacked. Okay, so all these things are leading to a buildup of tension in the country over this issue of slavery. Okay, and we see it in politics as well. And so the 1850s see a splintering of politics, of political groups, as they're trying to figure out how do we handle the slavery question. And it wasn't only the slavery question, there was other questions too. So there was this question of, right, are we primarily a country of states that are kind of loosely organized, or are we sort of one government and the states just kind of have a little bit of control? This age-old debate, right? We saw that the War of 1812 provided a lot of unity as we're one country, but there was still a lot of people that viewed their primary identity as a citizen was to a particular state rather than to the country as a whole. We also see a lot of people moving and immigrating to the United States, and a lot of these people didn't fit in with the status quo. They weren't necessarily British Anglicans, right? We had people that spoke different languages, people that were Catholics, and so there was this debate about what role they should play in America. So there was actually this Native Party, which was not pro-Native Americans, but was pro what they viewed it themselves as the natives. These were the British Protestant Anglicans, and they kind of wanted America to stay a country of English-speaking, right, Anglicans, and there was this problem with all of these new groups moving in, Italians, right, and Irish and Germans, and what role they play in America. Okay, and then of course there was the issue of slavery and what to do with new territories. Should they be slave territories? Should they be free? Should they be allowed to vote on what they want to be instead of letting Congress determine if that state was going to be admitted as a free state or a slave state? And ultimately, this whole debate over all these things destroys what was the main political party in the U.S., the Whigs. So at the time, there was two main political parties, the Whigs and the Democrat Republicans, who were mainly known as the Democrats, and who today we would call the Democrats. And the Whigs disappear, and obviously we don't have a Whig party now. because it caused so much trouble. And the other main political party, like I said, was the Democrat Republicans, or Democrats for short. And they actually split over the issue of slavery into two different political parties, the Northern Democratic Party and the Southern Democratic Party. Now, eventually, post-Civil War, we get the Democratic Party that we know today. But at the time, it actually split. So the two main political parties, one disappeared, the other split in two over all of these things. And we get a new political party that appears on the scene, which is the Republican Party that we know of today. Although, of course, what was important to the Democrats of the 1850s and to the Republicans of the 1850s are very different from what is important or on the party platform for the Democrats and the Republicans today. The Republican Party gets founded in 1854, Jackson, Michigan, and starts to become a major player in the politics of the day. Okay, and the first big election that the Republicans are going to have a say in or a chance in is the election of 1860. Okay, there's a lot of questions that are coming up in the election of 1860. One is there a right to secede or to leave the United States? And South Carolina had actually tried this earlier under Andrew Jackson and basically been told, nope, you can't leave. But it's still going to come up again. Okay. The election of 1860 is going to be ultimately won by Lincoln, and he is a Republican, and his early priority is to maintain the Union of the United States. And what we see is that he realizes that his election is going to potentially break the nation apart. And so he, even though he's, against slavery, what he tries to assure the southern states is, my goal is to keep the U.S. together, and I don't want to take away your slavery. But what we're going to see is that even though he says that, right, I don't want to take away your slavery, I want to keep the U.S. together, most of the southern states view him as so clearly anti-slavery that they think that he's going to do it anyway. And so they're going to start the process of trying to leave and become their own country. And that's how we get the Civil War. So here's the election map from 1860. And the Republicans were really helped by the fact that the Democrats had split. So you can see here, if you look at the actual popular vote, here is the Southern Democrats and here is the Northern Democrats. And so if the Democratic Party had not split, they are the biggest party at this time. Okay, and then the Republicans actually made up a smaller portion, but because the Democrats were split, it allows the Republicans to get the majority of the votes and also the majority of the electoral votes, and that is what is going to propel Abraham Lincoln to become president in 1861. So you can see that in red here are all the states that voted for Lincoln. Blue is the states that voted for the Southern Democrat, and in the middle we have another party that I didn't talk about, the Constitutional Union Party. So you can see that the country is very divided on north-south lines here, right? I mean, you can basically draw a line, and you got the Republicans north of it, the Southern Democrats south of it, and the Constitutional Union Party in the middle. So the country is very divided north and south, which is unsurprising because the Civil War is going to begin. So here is Abe Lincoln, and here is him giving his inaugural address. So, nowadays we have the benefits of televisions and our big LCD screens and microphones. But at the time, you really had to crowd in, and the president had to be sort of as exposed as possible to project his voice. And you can see that they're actually doing a lot of work on the Capitol at the time. The actual Capitol building is actively here being worked on. Okay. So up next is to talk about the actual Civil War.